This is Not Another Church Podcast with your host, Pastor Tom.
All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This is Not Another Church Podcast. I'm Pastor Tom, the senior pastor at North Glencoe Baptist Church, and your host. And I'm here today with...
Hey, everybody. My name's Donna, and I am the Women's and Children's Minister here at North Glencoe.
And I'm Matt, and I am the student pastor here at North Glencoe.
And last week we dealt with Abram. We kind of ended with the covenant that God made, the repetition of the covenant that God made with Abraham. And I want to read what God specifically says because it's going to be important as we come into the next story. It says, "The word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. I am your shield, and your reward shall be very great. And Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring." Now, I think it is interesting and of note that Abraham, in his faith, is recognizing the primary cause of his childlessness is God.
Yeah.
And that's important moving forward because that's going to make the sin that he commits with Hagar and Sarah even worse because he recognizes that God's the reason why he's childless. So the word of the Lord came to him and said, No, this man shall not be your heir, your very own son, shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and looked toward heaven, number the stars. If you're able to number them, then he said, so shall your offspring be. And so God is telling Abram that you are going to have a son, and that son is going to be the child of promise, the child of the covenant. He tells him more about what's going to happen to his relatives, but the takeaway is, again, that all the world will be blessed. You're going to have all of the offspring. It's more than the stars in the sky, more than the sand on the beach.
More than the stars we see in the city.
Yes. So
yeah.
all you're going to have all these kids. And Abram is an old man now. His wife is an old woman. And so he is, while recognizing that God is in control and being full of faith in that regard, he also, we see here with Eliezer, his nephew, he's trying to hook God up. And so it's easy for me to read this story in Genesis and go, how can you be at the same, almost the same breath, God, you're the one who's made me childless. I recognize that, so let me hook you up. So something of high faith and then low faith, right back to back. And again, as we've said, and this will be a recurring thing, then I think of how I do things.
Yeah, I was going to say, don't you stop, though, and think, oh, I think I do that quite a bit in my life. And at this point in the story, we're at Abraham and Sarah, then, or Abram and Sarah, we are into normal, we've fallen down to something what we would consider somewhat normal lifespans at this point.
Yes, in the hundreds. I mean, it's still...
a little extended from
what
we're used to.
A little extended, but it's still... it's like what we have today.
Clearly past childbearing age.
Yes. In fact, Sarah will say... I'm past the time when I can. She's gone through menopause. I'm past the time when I'm going to have kids.
Yes.
And so, but before we start going into it, I do want to talk about in this. Okay, so one extreme that can be taken is, and we saw this a lot with COVID. Okay, so God's in control, so I'm not wearing a mask. I'm not going to do anything that anybody suggests I do. And when I walk into a store, I'm going to be that arrogant, in your face. I ain't wearing a mask. I'm just trusting God. Okay, we see that on one extreme. Mm-hmm. The other extreme is I've got to completely and totally hook God up because he clearly isn't bright enough to take care of things. And we don't even have to take COVID. I mean, you can take personal health. On one extreme, I'm going to eat all the bacon. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. I'm not going to walk any further than my chair to the TV because God's in control. And then the other extreme is that
I'm going to run every
it becomes
5K
an idol.
And yeah.
Control
my diet, control my exercise, control everything.
Chickpeas and water only.
Yes.
Because it's in my control.
So in both of those scenarios, we have to recognize that there's a balance here. And we see that where David prays, God strengthen the gates of Jerusalem. Specifically prays that. And yet goes and hires people to build up the gates of Jerusalem. Okay, so I don't see a contradiction of me praying, God, heal me, and then taking my medicine. And so what we have to get is balance, and that balance comes down to who's actually in control.
Right.
And so what we often do is we create the illusion in our life that we're the one who is actually in control. It's almost like
But we all live with that kind of day to day, don't you? Don't you find yourself?
Oh, absolutely.
That, like, I'm in control of this car that I'm driving, or I'm in, you take it for granted until you have that almost accident or that almost health issue or that this or that or the other that God uses to pull your attention back to realize that He is ultimately in charge of that. I mean, just a small incident of it, but I had someone who pulled out in front of me the other day at a notorious intersection here locally where there's a constant wrecks, and they just, I don't know if they didn't see me, weren't paying attention, I have no idea, but they literally pulled out from me. I did the whole fishtail stop and got stopped and within like inches of their car. And they just zoomed on and went on, and I'm jelly-legged, and, but it was another moment where God uses those little things as we go through them to remind us that, while you're driving the car, ultimately, I'm in charge of all things.
And I think that's a really good example of bringing that into a big. Instead of now, you've kind of got a wide view instead of, I guess, tunnel vision. I guess because sometimes I think that's what I'll settle into, telescope, tunnel vision, whatever kind of analogy you want to use. There is I'm really focused on, and I'm. It's not that I'm being super I'm intentionally being arrogant or rebellious, I guess, but I'm focused on, okay, this is what I've got to do, and this is how I'm serving, and this is how I've got to get this done, and I've got to do my checklist, and I've got to put my check in the box. I've got to get this stuff done, and if I don't, I feel like I get in that kind of ebb and flow kind of thing, and that's not bad. We need to be productive. We need to do what our vocation is, or whatever. But when those kind of things happen, or you kind of for a COVID example, all of COVID or that kind of thing is a really good example of how it opens us up to realizing that, hey, all of this, and this being life, it's bigger than just you. And I think, again,
we think everybody thinks the way we do.
Yeah, I think that's true.
I want them to be a driver knowing at that particular intersection that you always have to look 5 times before you pull out.
And that's ultimately rooted in pride, because how I think is obviously the best way to think.
We're the hero of our own movie.
Yeah,
yeah,
and that's a really good way of putting it. And so this is COVID, and those kind of things. I've really tried to open my eyes and my heart up to realizing that, hey, you are just not even a chess piece, because you're not even that big, because you are just like a speck of dust on the chessboard kind of thing. It's really,
but at the same time, we're still important, and God knows.
Yeah.
Everything about
it.
Yeah.
I guess it's just to say, talking to myself, I can't be. If I'm the hero, if I'm making all the decisions, if I'm the main character, if I'm making the story crash and burn or succeed and take off. If it's up to me, it doesn't matter how much I do. It doesn't matter how many check marks I put in the box. It doesn't matter how much I get done. It doesn't matter how productive I am. At the end of the day, I'm going to fail at something, some way, somehow. It's just that's if it's this story, spoiler alert, I screw it up every time. Some way, somehow. And so for me, realizing that, I guess like you said, that I'm not the hero, I'm not, and it's not as far as I'm not David or whatever. That's not different. I'm not the hero of that story. Different one.
King David. Yes.
But to realize that it's not about me. Even if Matt, if I'm doing good things, I'm not going off living however I want to live. And as Tom says, swinging from the chandeliers in Guadalajara or wherever he's going to go. Tijuana, that's where you're at. You're at Tijuana. Where it's not that I'm doing those things. Like I'm doing good things.
Yeah.
But doing good thing, a lot of people do good things, but not a lot of people follow Jesus, and that's I guess that's kind of the difference.
And always at the center of that is who I am in relation to God. Like that sense of humility, where the opposite of pride, where we realize that who I am in relation to God means that He's moving all the chess pieces, if you will, and I am a player on the board, but only at His hand and only at His will. And at the same time that He allows me to do that and allows me to come alongside and receive the joy and the beauty of the things that we do, walking alongside Him and in His guidance. But all of that has to stay central focused. And I say that very well here in the mic, talking to everybody, but I don't always do that.
Absolutely.
I'm like, yeah, I got this, God. Go help the people who need you, kind of thing.
Yeah.
In fact, we said that the other day in one of our women's Bible studies when we were talking about humility. And we kind of get this idea that we've got this, but those other people don't have it.
Well, that's kind of where Abram's at. It's like Abram's
story.
like I've got all this going on for me. So like I don't understand. Like God, here's
and it's fixing to get ugly.
Yeah, it is, and because eventually
Yeah.
you start getting into well, now I'm trying to hook God up. Well, now I'm trying to do the work for Him, and now I'm trying to be God, and like it's just kind of a slippery slope, I guess.
And I'm trying to hook myself up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I guess I can empathize, sympathize. I get those confused. I can identify with the fact of even if like I'm in my tunnel, I'm in my telescope, like I am focused in on doing what I've been called to do and doing and again, like called to do is not ministry, but just following Jesus. Like I feel like I'm doing the stuff to do that, but
Many are called, but few are chosen.
that kind of thing. Like not ministry, just following Jesus. When I'm doing that, I feel like sometimes I can get so focused on doing the things that make me look like I'm following Jesus in an effort to follow Jesus, but I'm actually not spending time in following Jesus. I'm chasing after the proof of what it looks like for me to follow Jesus than actually following Jesus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And let me just say, I think I've told y'all before, we're in the women's Bible study. One of the women who listened to the podcast was saying the other day, one of our Wanda, one of our ladies in our group, she uses the term meddling, and so I want to give her due credit on that. But I've laughed now because when you did that, and you start talking about doing the things that make it look like I'm following Jesus, because I really want to follow Jesus, but I also want it to appear that I'm following Jesus.
Ultimately, because I focus on the.
But I feel like you're meddling in my life. That's where I'm going.
I focus on the byproducts of following Jesus, but I actually don't focus on the meat grinding part of following Jesus,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like I focus on, for lack of a better analogy, I focus on what comes out of the sausage grinder than the making of the sausage. I've heard you say that before.
Yeah.
I think I focus on that.
The Instagram post is more important than the substance.
Yeah, like what people see, and even in a church setting, and this part does zero in a church, what we produce on Sundays, to me, I can get more focused on that, making sure that everything runs well, or Wednesdays or whatever sounds good. Everybody's where they're supposed to be.
And the pictures
all of that, and
yeah.
it's not that those are bad things, but if those things are not accompanied by a Holy Spirit driven following of Jesus, then we're just gathering in a building for nothing. And Paul says that out of everybody, you would be pitied the most if you're doing all of this outside of Christ. And so all of this, like COVID and just this whole probably like year to 18 months, has really kind of broken my spirit in that of realizing, are you actually following Jesus to make disciples, or are you just following the byproduct because that just seems like the way to go? And there's a difference in between the two.
Because it makes you feel good about yourself.
Yeah, for sure.
Instead of feeling.
Well, you think I have a place to belong. I have people to be around that are like-minded in most cases. I don't really want to. I know that being a bad person is bad. Like I have good morals or whatever. Like we can. But and it all comes down to if I'm chasing the byproduct and not the actual product. If I'm chasing the byproduct and not the source, then I'm out of whack, and that's a problem.
Yeah, and as you're listening to us, as we're talking about it, this is letting you know that even your church staff, that as we're doing this, sometimes having the word pastor or a minister or something like that attached to who you are, there's an up and down walk, and there's a responsibility that we owe and fight against, and that sense of where It just becomes a job, and we go through that roller coaster of that walk with Christ in each one of us.
Yeah.
And sometimes I'm not sure that we're vulnerable enough to our congregation or to our fellow brothers and sisters to let them know there are times that we struggle with that in those places too. Not particularly us. I say we, collective of all church staff.
Yeah, I
and
mean,
all
not us.
pastors.
What about all the
No,
other people who are on
no.
church
Yeah,
staff?
everybody else.
Yeah, not us.
The people
I
in
try
line.
not to point at Matt or Donna or Tom. Yeah, but
Them
I
other
mean,
heathens.
But we do that. I mean, we don't. Sometimes I don't think we stop and go, yeah, we fight this too.
So let's get back to the text, because this is going to expose that hugely.
Yes.
Right on the heels, it says that God says to Abram, "To your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates." Now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. So Sarah says, "Look, I've got this servant."
I'm
This is
sorry.
not a good
I'm
idea.
sorry. Abraham's
Yeah.
like, you know what?
Well, if you
Can't,
say so.
can't complain.
Well, if you feel like that's what we need to do.
This never works,
I'm not
y'all.
even
I
trying
mean-
to be crude, but that's just so typical and
That is
funny.
so male.
I know. That is the most guy thing in the history of time. Is, you know what, honey?
If that's what you feel.
If you just think this is best, if this is just what you think is the best thing to do,
And then he shuts up, runs out of the tent.
yeah, then he's done. So like
He grabs the polo off the counter.
Yeah, you
If
meant.
you think.
No, you mean like now, like right now? Okay, cool.
So where's Hagar at? So Abram hears her.
Oh, my gosh.
Listens, and after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram her son as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Shockingly, this plan's not working out.
That's crazy.
Well, outside of stepping outside of God's plan never works out. But B, on just to like a day-to-day level, planned adultery is still adultery, and it still causes problems.
It's going to cause huge problems.
A huge problem that we're still paying for.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Now, and I want to pause here for a minute and point out. Okay, so we're recording this in the deep South. In fact, I don't think it gets much deeper, because once you leave
think it
Lower
does.
Alabama, you really start getting out of the South.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's kind of a boundary down
There is
below
a
us.
boundary.
Yeah.
Once you get
Yeah.
so south, you're essentially just in you're just in North Florida again, and but it's still Alabama because everybody's at the beach all the time.
Yeah, we're in.
We're as
we're
deep as it gets.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we're definitely.
And so the pet sin that everybody likes to point to and talk about how wicked it is, at least among people 45 or plus, is homosexuality.
Yeah.
And I want us to take a moment and recognize that the reason why homosexuality is a sin is because it's rebellion against God's plan for sexuality. That's the reason why it's a sin. I mean, we saw last week that anything that's not of faith is sin. So we're not trusting God that the plan that He has. And I have been asked a lot. In fact, I think I shared from the pulpit that on Easter Sunday, I had one of our deacons stop me in the gathering area with a group of men standing around, and as I'm running around with all these extra people here for Easter, and said, "So do you think that people are born homosexual?" And I'm like, "Really? You're gonna?"
Today seems like a good
Today.
time to ask that. Yeah.
Why don't I go ahead and take mute off my mic, and I'll deal with this question right now. So it is a very common question, and my response to that is always the same. Absolutely. And I'm born an adulterer. If I did whatever my heart wanted to do, if I did what was right in my own eyes, I would have blown my marriage up a long time ago with adultery. That's just the reality, that we all have certain sin tendencies. And so are some people born and they, because of what happened to them in their life, because of as they came to maturation sexually, that they were exposed to certain things and they weren't exposed to other things, that they're naturally drawn to the same sex? Absolutely. But that is the same lack of faith that comes from adultery, from pornography, from people who are having sex anytime outside of what God defines as what marriage is for.
Right.
And I can point to my heart naturally trending toward adultery in this. I don't know what's best for me. I had no idea when I was 25 years old what a marriage would look like at 30 years of marriage. I mean, I couldn't even comprehend that thought process, and that the depth of a relationship with another human being comes from not the emotionally high up here times, but comes from the nights with a sick kid, the financial struggles that we get through together, the walks every night together, all of those sort of things, and the good times and the bad times together, building those stones together so that a lifetime built together is rich and deep and so much more meaningful.
Yeah.
I had no idea that that was possible, even though people had said those words to me. Until you live it, until you taste of it. I mean, describe Dr. Pepper to somebody. And
Spicy cherries. Done.
It's got to be cold. But as we talk about it, I mean, you and I are sitting here on that side of marriage after several years, and we know the depth and richness of it. But we're sitting with Matt, who is engaged, about to be married, and he's just starting in. And at your point, Matt, just like Tom and anybody else who's listening to this, in the early days, we cannot even begin to comprehend when two become one. What that means is that two different people, and as you go through the depth of the earliest years, when you start with the first struggles that you deal with, all the way through, almost 30 years for us of marriage, and the things that you've been through, the job changes and losses and the financial ups and downs, and the kids that are doing something right or doing something wrong, or the sickness of parents and grandparents and caretaking of others and all of that stuff, that it matters. And when you're on that side of it and you see all of those boundaries that God has put in place for a reason, it starts to become a little clearer.
And so Abraham, who didn't have the benefit of the law here, he doesn't have the 10 Commandments to tell him because it hadn't been given yet, did have, and the fact that Abram's story is passed to us, to Moses. We know that Abram would have known, just because the information had to pass from person to person to person, that God had said, and a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and the two become one flesh. That is the foundation of the sexual ethic that defines the entire Bible. So Abram knew that. So when his wife comes up with a plan to where she's going to help God out, God has not given me a child. So what we're going to do is we're going to step outside of what God has defined.
Anything that comes after that statement just
Is
again,
gonna
spoiler
be
alert,
wrong.
is bad news. Bad news.
I love Charles Spurgeon's quote: "When given the choice between two evils, choose neither." Because I hear lots of Christians lots of times saying, well, it's the lesser of two evils for thousands of things.
Oh, yeah.
So what I think this story shows us is stepping outside of what God explicitly said to help God out is lack of faith. And whatever doesn't come from faith is sin. It's going to lead to sin, or it's going to be explicit sin in the beginning. And so God doesn't need our help. And now you understand maybe why when I started this, and we used the example of COVID, we used that balance of I've got to be obedient. There's my responsibility in things that I do. If I do live my whole life eating Reese cups and not moving, and I die at 50 from a heart attack, that's expected. But ultimately, I could die at 50 of a heart attack anyway, because that's on God. So I've got to do the things that God has commanded me to do, those spiritual disciplines, being in the Word, being in prayer. Otherwise, I know what the results are going to be, but God is sovereign. And so here we see God had a plan. He wanted the story to be, there's no way that he could have a kid, there's no way that she could have a kid, I gave them a kid. And so that meant for 20 years, there's the pain of, we don't understand what God's doing. And God doesn't explain to them what he explains to them what he's ultimately going to do, but he doesn't explain to them that's not going to happen right away. I mean, if God came to me in a vision and said, "Hey, you're going to have you got to use my God voice. Hey, can you hit the bumpers?
I can't do that.
You are going to have a child." My assumption is in 10 months I'm having a kid. Not in 20 years I'm going to have a kid.
Yeah.
And I think that the problem lies with me, though, in that, not with God. And so when God says in his word that in the book of Ephesians that all the riches of God are mine now, and that it is so true that I am literally in the heavenly places, in that, it's kind of like, when we will say, I'm trying to think of an example. Alabama's having a good year. We'll say, we're in the national championship game, but kind of thing. And I know I just made half my audience really angry, but Auburn doesn't go to national championship games, right? I mean.
Oh, and moving right along.
But Paul is so assured of the fact that we have the riches of heaven in the book of Ephesians. He says we're in the heavenly places. And yet, I'm going to walk out of this building and still be in a fallen world.
Yeah, it's raining outside really bad.
Yeah, you may. It may be thunder and lightning,
Probably
so you
can
can hear it.
Yeah, you might be able to hear the thunder and the lightning and the rain right now because it is coming out cats and dogs or what other animals.
But we may have a wreck. People that we know and love will die.
Yes.
We will die.
Yes.
All of those things are true because we live in a fallen world, and yet. God is saying, just rest in me. Mm-hmm. And that is literally a daily dying to self. That's so hard to do. So while we want to point our finger at Abram and Sarah and go, okay, clearly this plan was not going to work. Just from a human standpoint.
I'm thinking that the wisdom that's supposed to come with age they've skipped a bit here. I'm going, did they really think this was just going to?
I mean, the very fact that
issues?
When it says that when she got pregnant, so here Sarah has gone 90 years without being able to be pregnant. She comes up with this plan, and then she looks at her handmaiden, and she's pregnant. Even if Abram wasn't involved, she's going to be jealous and upset.
Yes, absolutely.
And so the fact that her husband impregnated her, and it says that she when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. That's an understatement. She's angry here to the nth degree at this woman.
And God.
Because
God
he
has
put her
given,
in this situation.
yes, she's in this situation. He's not fulfilled his promise in the way that she expected it, her assumptions.
So, Sarah said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you." It was her idea. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked at me with content. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram had to Sarah, "Behold, your servant is in your power to do as you please." So both of them are trying to watch their. We are right back to the garden. Sarah is saying to Abraham, "This is totally your fault." And Abram is saying, "This is totally your fault. And it's your problem to deal with." And he does like a man and walks out of the tent.
Yep.
I got to go cut the grass.
He's going to check on the flock. I mean, he is out.
Look, she's your servant. Do what you want to do. I don't care. I'm out. So,
but it's still his child.
So Sarah dealt harsh. Yeah, that part. He's out. He's done his part. I'm done.
But he's not really. He just doesn't want to handle it. He don't want to deal with it. But he's not really out.
Which we've talked about. One of the big temptations that men have is we just don't want to deal with this right now, whenever right now is.
Yes.
Molly called me yesterday morning. Her car wouldn't crank, and I didn't have. That was not on my calendar for the day.
Was she here?
No, she's in Nashville.
That's what I was wondering.
So,
did she expect you to come to Nashville?
No, she's walking around the car on FaceTime, showing me the motor.
Yeah, I was saying, as if you. Oh, there it is. That's it. Pull that leaf out, crank it up. You're gonna be fine.
We love you, Molly.
So, and anytime with a man, if you're planning on doing something and somebody throws a kink in no, I've got to go. No, that's not what I was going to do.
I have my own plan for the day.
I hate that. That causes me and Jesse's like biggest argument is like I have in my head like a plan to do something, how things are going to work, and then something small like.
But this happens with women too. We may handle it a little differently, but you really, because it all boils down to control.
I'm just a
I want
complete
my
jerk.
day to happen the way that I want it to because I am God. Or while we might not think all the way to that, come to that
Sure.
conclusion, that's where it is rooted in.
I would say, yes, women probably go. I've never been a woman, but
Don't plan on it either. That's not also not a part of your schedule.
yes, I will say that no hassle kind of an thing is almost it's a male thing because I see that in my brothers. I mean, when
I can see the differences in how you respond to it.
when I drive by a trailer and it's
women
got
were
5 or
mad, we
6
grow
broken
up-
down cars in the front, I understand. I may not do that, but I got you, bro. I understand why that happened
I feel you, brother.
because
Yeah.
you just don't want to deal.
See, that one's not me. That it's me on other things, but that one's I'm with you. That one's not it. That's not it.
That's not it.
Yeah, I'm not trying to get my money back or anything, or I'm definitely not gonna get around to fixing it one day. Just call a junker, come get it, please.
I up until really recently, I still had the very first vehicle I had ever owned at my parents' house. It was in the woods, but it did have a tree growing up into it. And it was there because at some point, you know what, I'm going to fix that thing
You're
up.
going to
Yeah.
fix that thing
It's a
up.
66 Dodge pickup truck. I'm going to fix that bad boy up. And the only reason it's not there now is somebody else drove by, saw it, and was like, hey, how much you take for that? And mom and dad called me and said, hey, I sold it for $1,200. You want the money? Because I'm tired of it sitting in my yard.
Thanks, Nancy.
Yes, I can't believe that.
So,
I can. Says the lady who would buy nut friends instead of nutty buddies. She's definitely selling that beat up truck for 100%.
Behind the scenes, we're all nodding. We do get it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
yes. So, Sarah, shockingly, Sarah is mean to Hagar, and Hagar flees. She ends up where she's out by herself. The angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she said, I'm fleeing from my mistress Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will surely multiply your offspring so that they cannot be numbered for the multitude. So one of the things that we see from this comes back to that imago Dei, that God's image is in everyone, even if the circumstances were sinful that they're around. Which brings me back to, and the reason I keep bringing it back to my context is because this is obviously where I live. It's always bothered me that we are so pro-life in that Baptist church, but when some teenager gets pregnant and she decides to keep the baby, we ostracize her. That really makes me mad because
Yeah.
that is an intellectual breakdown. If we don't want her to abort the baby, and we're all about pro-life, I'm not saying that we celebrate the sin that caused it, but at that point,
It's a human being.
that's a human being that
Yeah.
desperately needs this church to step along beside them.
And that
There's
the
two
kid
human
did
beings there.
once again. There's two there, and the kid didn't do anything. Like that. That's not the as in the unborn baby. Like it didn't do anything. So why are we gonna kick it to the curb or kick that? Why are we gonna? And like you said, like that's two people or hopefully three people. And so why are we gonna kick that family to the curb instead of? This is an opportunity to disciple them. This is an opportunity to show them who Jesus is, and go from there.
And hopefully, my experience from childhood till now, hopefully I've seen people who have come to understand and realize that what we're doing, that we should not ostracize, that we should come along and support and encourage and offer support and encouragement after the baby comes. That, that young mom is going to be struggling with all the things that all of us as young moms struggle with, and she may be doing it alone.
Well, we had a young lady
Or she's doing it in circumstances.
in Glencoe that became with child. We as a church allowed her to have a shower here. And I got several phone calls, both from within and without the church.
Did you really?
I did. And I had people who don't even go to church here who called me and said, "You're part of the problem because you are celebrating the fact that she has sinned." And I'm like, "No, we haven't printed that banner."
Yeah. Also, what is that on? What are we? That whole church thing we do. What is that? How is that almost any different in terms of we're having a service for sinners? Like that's what this building is for. That's what the church is supposed to do. It's a whole place full of sinners. And so if I come here and get if somebody came here and got a free meal, this past Sunday when we did a fundraiser, if somebody paid for or whatever, the principle's the same. We're doing stuff it's sinners doing stuff for sinners. I mean, like I don't understand. That's kind of
and we don't do it perfectly or consistently, and that's one of the things that we have to constantly watch and guard against. But I am heartbroken that you had received that many calls. I did not know that.
That's a tough argument to make when the next time somebody wants to have something here, that person may want to call you, want to have something here at our church. It's like, and it's not me again, not trying to be judgmental, but it's like, well, we don't let sinners in here to do anything. You know what I'm saying? I mean, like that's a really tough argument to make because it's one of those things that as I'm pointing a finger at somebody, there's about 3 or 4 more pointing back at me.
Yeah.
Well, and we all have that blind spot. So
we do.
I recently put up a quote from one of the Puritans, and I had somebody online that jumped me because this person didn't speak out against slavery in their lifetime to enough to make this person happy. And I actually said, so if I cut out all the people that have open sin in their lives, then I can't quote anybody outside of Jesus. I mean, Paul himself called himself the chief of sinners. There's balance there.
Right.
But like I said in the sermon, if Hitler said that the sky was blue and that's truth, just because Hitler said it doesn't make it untrue.
Right.
And so I might, in a sermon even, quote Nietzsche because he says something. Doesn't mean that I support Nietzsche or support everything that he ever said.
His philosophy anyway.
And so bringing it back home, in this particular case, every human being that's born, or that's unborn, every human being that's conceived carries the image of God. They carry the imago Dei. A big part of what is laid down from end to end in the Bible is that man is made in the image of God and that God so loves the world.
Yeah.
And that if we in the church don't ooze love on everybody, then we're doing the same thing that Sarah did here. We're helping God out. And so we've got to be really careful for that because it's really easy for me to be in Walmart or in Johnson's, and there's somebody, that shows up at 3 o'clock in the afternoon wearing their PJ pants, and they stink, and they clearly are high, and me to, in my mind or in my heart, to go, thank you, God, that I'm not like them. And so as we said earlier, that every day that I get up, I've got to fight to die to myself. We didn't use that word, but we talked about not being the hero of my own story. That's what dying to yourself is. Making Jesus the hero of my story today, and I've got to do that every day. A big part of that is recognizing that, and not even to a level of, but for the grace of God, except for the grace of God, go I. But it's actually on a heart level recognizing that I do go there sometimes.
And so as you've read this story and as we're talking, what keeps circulating through my mind for a woman is I'm thinking about Hagar's desperation, that she was so desperate to get away from Sarah. Sarah's so angry. There's such a rivalry and a bitterness that's sprung up from this whole situation. And Abraham's walking away and not wanting to handle it. You're seeing the results of his lack of dying to self, his willingness to step in, to lead, even in this situation, on multiple levels with every part of it. But I keep thinking about Hagar and what she went through, and had Abraham done what he was supposed to from the beginning, how it would have changed.
And so we're going to end this story and end today with Hagar confessing that God is the God that sees. And we would do well just as human beings, but also as believers to recognize that God is a God that sees. It's kind of like we said a few weeks ago that be not deceived, God is not mocked. Whatever you sow, you reap. Can be super scary or really beautiful according to what you sow. God being the God that sees can be both horrifying and comforting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It can be super convicting and amazing that the God that created the universe, I mean, on a micro level, if you look at how the human body fits together and how, cancers are being born in every human being every second. God just has a system that destroys them. And you've got all of these issues that go on here and the times that we pull out in front of a car, or a time a car pulls out in front of us and we're just seconds off, or the times when, a tornado goes through an area and you look at it and this side of the road, all the houses are destroyed, and the other side of the road, it doesn't even look like there's been a storm. And all of those things, it can be comforting. It can be it's our job to remember that God is God and we aren't. He is sovereign. He's in control and he knows. And as we looked at the book of Revelation, that was one of the things that came out.
Often, which I've said this multiple times, like through that depth, that study of Revelation, you think of a Revelation and you think of the scary and the freaky and the unknown and all of those things. I mean, there's an aspect of that. But to see how often that John relays the message that God is portraying, or that God is showing him, that God knows exactly what's going on. And in the weirdest way ever, the book of the Revelation is extremely, extremely, extremely encouraging and comforting. And while that sounds super weird, it's the idea that constantly in the worst of in some of the worst times of history ever, God has everything moving and shifting exactly like he wants it to, exactly how he has commanded it to. It has a certain, the darkness, the power, Satan has a certain limit. He has a line in which he can't cross. And all of those things wrapped up is encouraging to know that in all of that planning and moving, he knows me, he sees me, he loves me, he sent his son to die for me. That in all of that craziness and movement, that I am a small part of that. Again, I'm not the hero. It's because of Christ's work on the cross and that the grave is empty. But to know that I'm just a part of that. As I said earlier, I'm not the hero. I do get stuck in tunnel vision. But to know who my hero is and that I get to play a little bit of a part in that is encouraging. That he does see, that he is in control, he is sovereign. And so that was crazy throughout Revelation, and you see that all throughout Scripture. That it all boils down. It all comes back to that God has had a plan from the get-go. Like we're just middle in the book of Genesis, and we're talking about, we made a connection to Revelation. Like we made a connection of all throughout the rest of history because God is in control. It's not a coincidence. All these things didn't come together by an accident. It's one miraculous maker who is orchestrating everything. And it's encouraging for us that we can have just a small part to play in this, but ultimately all of that being done so that we can worship and glorify him.
And at the same time, a small child in northern China right now is known by God and seen by God, and he's orchestrating his life, my life here, my brothers and sisters just in this church body, and that he can accomplish so many different layers of things simultaneously, and all of them ultimately reach the goals that he has for his honor and glory.
Well, that's the story of Sarah and Hagar and Abram. I hope that's been edifying for you today. We're going to continue with the story of Abram. Apparently, we're going to be in it for a month or so. So look forward to that. Go serve your king.
This has been Not Another Church podcast with your host, Pastor Tom. Thanks for listening, and go serve your king.